Hi. This is a talk about how to have a big impact in the world by making something people want. And bringing something new into the world is incredibly hard. It's Paul Graham, my co-founder, describes it as like fighting an army with 1 billion people, except instead of trying to kill you, they're just trying to ignore you. So when you're trying to do something new, you've got to expect to struggle, for years and years while everyone ignores you. And then when you succeed, they'll all say, well, that was obvious, and I could have done the same thing. So if you just want a quiet, relaxing life, don't try to start something. But if there is something you feel compelled to bring into the world, I'll try and share some experience about what worked for me and other people. Here's sort of an outline. I'll talk about why you would start a startup. And because this is a talk containing advice, it should have the big warning label like FDA contains advice, be careful. I'll talk about where that experience comes from, since you should be always skeptical of advice and at least know where it comes from. And I'll talk about why Combinator, what we do and what we've learned funding a lot of startups. And then give advice about those various things. And then talk about some ideas and trends that we're really excited about that we think are going to be the driving force behind the next wave of startups. So why start a startup? The majority of new products and services coming out in the world are coming from startups. And historically, that's surprising. If you talk to economists or big company executives in the 1970s and 80s, they would be very surprised to learn that, in 30 years from now, most of the new products and services would be coming from startups. They would think, how can 2 or 3 guys and an idea beat companies with billions of dollars in capital and engineering teams and factories and brand and distribution networks. But that's what's happening. So the TLDR of 21st century business is, if you want to get an idea out in the world, start a startup. But it's not for everyone. We figure less than 1 in 1,000 people are suited to it. And it's not brains that's the limiting factor. Most people are smart enough. It's the inclination and the determination to stick with an idea that everyone is trying to ignore for long enough for them to take it seriously. Some of the advice is about how to do that. It's a long, hard road. I've watched lots of people suffer on it, and I've watched lots of teams fall apart with the difficulty of it. But it sure is interesting. So, okay, so here's what I'm going to talk about, where my experience comes from. So the first startup was called ViaWeb, and it's basically, this month is the 20th anniversary of me writing the first line of code for it. When I was a grad student at Harvard. And it grew to 20 employees and 1,000 paying customers. And we eventually sold it to Yahoo for $50 million. And I stayed with it for a while. We grew it to 20,000 merchants, selling $10 million a day of stuff online. These days, Shopify is the company winning in that space, because ours has been sort of neglected for 15 years now. So when I started, I was a computer science grad student and had no particular thought of starting a business. I thought starting a business was something that business guys did, and what us computer scientists did was program. And so I assumed I'd sort of work in a research lab. I worked at Bell Northern Research at one point. Thought that would be the place I might go back to. But these two friends from grad school shared this idea with me, and the idea hooked me. And the idea was writing software that worked over the web, which was just like this crazy new idea in 1995. And what hooked me about it was the idea that you could release software, instantly. At the time, like most software, the way it worked was you'd have a team of programmers write it, and then you'd burn it onto floppy disks, and then you'd put it in retail stores, and people would buy it, and it would be months between the time you stopped writing the software and the time anyone got to use it, and more months before you would get feedback about bugs and features it was missing. And so when we realized that, if you wrote this software that ran through a web browser, you could just like edit the code on the server and hit return, and like all of a sudden 100% of your users would now have the new version. That was so like, it was like a mesmerizing idea. I couldn't let it go. So I decided to join up and build this kind of software. And the particular software we chose to write after thrashing around a little bit was this e-commerce software. At the time, there were like 5 online stores. Amazon was one of them. And they were all sort of, hand-built by big teams of programmers. But we thought there ought to be lots of online stores. We knew that there were 50,000 companies that mailed out paper catalogs and took mail order, and so we thought, well, they should all be online someday. So let's write the software that they're going to use to build their online stores. So we did that, and it worked pretty well. Like I said, we grew to thousands of customers and $10 million a day in orders going through the system. Let's see, what was the rest of this? It turns out that as well as having this wonderful property of like being able to get immediate feedback on changes and ideas you put in the software, also things can break in the middle of the night, and you have to, and programming becomes like now a 24-hour job. Like you're like a fireman as well as a programmer. And so after like 6 years of doing that, it kind of wore on my patience, and I decided to go do something else. And I actually tried. So talking about when I say it's easier to get an idea out into the world in a startup than it is in a big company, I tried within the big company that Yahoo had become. It was like 10,000 people by this time, to try and get a couple of new ideas out, and found it difficult and frustrating, and realized that it was more a political game than a technology game. So I started my own thing. So the second startup was not really a success. It seemed like a good idea, Telepresence Robots for remote workers. So it was this robot that you could remote control. And so if you're working from home, you have your web browser interface, and you can drive this thing around, and you can interact with people. More like the way you would if you were physically there. On the theory that, like, there were a bunch of video conference things. There was Skype, and there were, the big wall-mounted video conference things. But those were sort of either like inherently one-to-one, or like you had to sort of schedule everyone to be in a conference room. And we wanted remote people to just be able to be not at a disadvantage, and be able to do the same things they would. But, so it seemed like a plausible idea, but after, 2 years of trying to find good applications for it, we couldn't find any. We tried all kinds of things. We tried, managers of remote offices. One of our users was the CEO of a company that had 4 offices around the world, and he liked to manage by walking around. So we had some sort of, I don't know, it wasn't good enough. So we were wrong. And when you're wrong, you know you're wrong, but you don't really know why. It could be like it's a bad idea and no one will ever want this. It could be just too early, that like there's something you're waiting for out in the world that'll change, and then it'll become a good idea. It could be too early in the sense that you don't have the technology to build it good enough to make it really useful. There was some of that, like our battery life was only 4 hours and the thing was kind of heavy, and so obviously that would have gotten better. Or it could be you're wrong for things that are the reasons you should be able to fix, like your sales strategy is wrong or you're targeting the wrong application. It's hard to tell. And like entrepreneurship, you have to get comfortable with being wrong. Like you sort of start 80% wrong and maybe over 10 years work your way down to only 20% wrong. And like in normal life, you're not used to that, like unless you're married. Because in normal life, you're in a known environment, right? And you like go to class and you write the test and you get 80% or, But so in this crazy world of trying to bring something new into the world, like you have to assume that most of what you believe is wrong. And you're trying to, what you got to do is try to test it against the real world as soon as possible, rather than proceed on these wrong assumptions and then make more wrong assumptions. So iteration speed is usually the thing that distinguishes great startups from startups that fail. And it's easier with some things than others, like software, like in the first company I was talking about, web-based software, you can iterate in minutes. Sometimes we fixed bugs like while people were still on the phone. But hardware, like if you are really disciplined about it, you can probably iterate something every week, but it's expensive and often it ends up being longer than a week between iterations. So the third company, third startup was this different thing. It's a company that creates other companies. We started in 2005 investing a small amount of money in a large amount of companies and trying to work with them to give them advice. Like the thing about advice is advice drawn from your own experience of 2 or 3 things is worth something. Advice drawn from experience of like 100 things is worth more. And advice drawn from having given advice and seen whether it worked or not, and then tried giving different advice and seeing whether that worked or not, is this thing that like it's very rare to get to actually, but we figured like we were going to build this organization that would let us get there. We would fund like enough startups that we actually figured out the crazy rules of this game. And it was a solution to a problem that we'd had ourselves. In that first startup, ViaWeb, we had a lot of trouble finding investors. We spent months at it. We finally found one who wrote us a check. He was like a nice and helpful guy, but he didn't have any particular startup experience and no internet experience. So we wanted to be the kind of investor that we wished we would have found. Someone who had seen like 100 startups and knew what worked and what didn't work. Okay, so these were kind of the principles that we started out with. Invest in technology and domain experts, not sort of business guys. I mean, business guys are fine, especially if it's a business-intensive company, but we were fine investing in companies where no one had any business experience at all, which was enormously controversial when we started doing this in 2005. These days, it's hard to argue with the success of Google and Facebook, neither of whom had any business experience. But at the time when we tried to convince other investors to invest money in us because we were going to invest it in people that didn't know anything about business, that was a tough sell. and and fundamentally invest in the people. We have lots of strong opinions about what ideas are good, but we're often wrong. So in general, like we invest in people we think are have the right qualities, and even if we don't really understand why the business is a good idea. And it seems obvious now, but at the time, like when companies failed, often the investors would try to sue them, sue the founders, for the money they'd lost. We realized that was crazy. Like half of startups fail. If the startups fail, like it's really not their fault, and we should support them and be nice to them and invest in them again. And we've had some great success from people that we've been, where their first 2 companies failed and the third one was wildly successful. And then create this community of founders, and that, it turns out, has been more powerful than any of these other things we did. That the community of founders helps each other, way more than we can. I mean, we have this unusual perspective of having seen more companies than most people, but what scales is the network of people. We funded, Sarah's numbers are a little out of date. We funded 940 companies now. So that, within those, people there's someone who's a domain expert in basically everything. And so one of the things you'll learn if you start a startup, that being a founder and CEO is lonely, because there are all these very painful and difficult things you have to deal with that you can't share with the rest of with the bigger team, including even the most successful companies, probably 5 times in the history of them, it will seem like everything is doomed, like it's going down, and you can't go telling your employees that. The only people that can really that you can really cry on their shoulder is fellow founders. So creating this network of founders who have all sort of promised to keep each other's secrets and be supportive of each other has been by far the most valuable thing. So what we do is that we take online applications twice a year from people that want to start a company, and we read all of them. We invite the promising ones to interview in person, and if accepted, we give them $120,000 in return for 7% of the company, and they become part of the community, and we meet with them regularly and try to help them figure out their business. So these are some of the well-known companies we've funded. Reddit, big popular website. Airbnb is now booking more room nights than the largest hotel chain, which is Hilton. That's another good one. Pebble, Canadians from Waterloo. It's a smart wristwatch that a lot of people like better than the Apple Watch, sort of different. Thalmic, those sort of moose antlers down there, is another Canadian one from Waterloo. It's this armband that lets you control video games in an interesting and intuitive way. Lots of, these are sort of what we think of as probably the best known 30 out of a lot. Is there another one? Oh, Dropbox, I should mention. Yeah. That was, believe it or not, that was a counterintuitive idea at the time. When they started in 2006, very few people had more than one computer. And so it was hard to explain why, everyone in the world would need this thing that synced their files between all their different devices when most people only had one. But we had something similar in grad school. There was this esoteric file sharing thing called the Andrew file system that we had. And so like we were among these few people that had this crazy complicated research version of a thing, and we thought, and like required a full-time system administrator to keep it working, but we could sort of imagine like how cool it would be if that just worked. So these are some up-to-date stats. Valuation, which I don't know if it really means much, but 65 billion. The total money raised by YC companies is like actual money at 7 billion. And there's like 40 that are doing pretty well by investors' metrics. 177 have failed. It's hard to estimate a success rate. I mean, definitely about a third fail. The usual way, like the rule of thumb we figure is like a third of them will fail, a third of them will do okay, and a third of them will do much better than okay. And the economics of that work out fine. We started doing mostly online things with a network effect. Like Reddit was in the first batch of companies we funded because we understood that world and we figured we'd do a lot more of those. But we've expanded a lot. It's no longer, like we haven't funded a social network in a long time. So we're doing a lot of hardware companies, a lot of biotech companies. I think biotech is probably the most exciting area to be in right now. The potential for things that synthetic biology can do is mind-boggling and will make all the other technologies seem kind of boring by comparison. And healthcare, Mike Moritz describes it as the most broken trillion-dollar industry in the world. In Canada, it's not as broken, but it is also, like, people are still dying here. So, like, until that's fixed, like, biotech is, healthcare is a giant pressing need. We funded, it was like 3 companies working on various cancer cures. The one that I think is coolest, the thing that they can do is they can take a biopsy sample of like your tumor and test it with thousands of off-the-shelf medicines, and surprisingly, like some of them work. So there are like many cancers require sort of like a poison to kill them, but it turns out that especially brain cancers often respond to generic, safe, off-the-shelf drugs. You just can't predict which ones unless you try 1,000 of them. So they're building this giant robot apparatus to test 1,000 of them. And there's a lot more like that are some combination of hardware and biotech that we're super excited about. But like our underlying mission is just to create more innovation. We started with startups because that was something we knew, and there are some good economics of it. But like we want to fund innovative things whether or not they make money for us. So we started funding nonprofits. WotC, as Sarah mentioned, is one of the best known. What they do is this radical thing, which is that you donate directly to fund a particular person's in the developing world's medical care. So you can go to WotC.org and like they got pictures of people that need something, and you can like for like typically about $300 you can, for example, set someone's broken leg. Feels pretty good actually. Like certainly if I saw someone on the street and their leg was broken and it would just cost $300 to fix it, I'd probably want to do it. It costs a lot more than that in the developing world or developed world, but this idea that rather than just sort of throwing money into some giant charity and you don't really know what happens, like you actually know what your money did, and you can personally fund like all or at least a good part of this person whose picture you've seen's treatment is compelling. We started this thing called the YC Fellows Program, which is investing in people before they're ready to start a startup. So we get like 6,000 applications every time we we our twice-a-year cycle, and we can only about 110 of them are ready to start a business. So the rest of those, like a lot of them seem like really good people, and we'd like to help them, but they don't have a business idea yet. So we started this thing to give them enough money to live on for a few months while they figure that out, and then we'll hopefully get to invest in them if it turns into a real company. We started sharing most of what we know online for free. The Sam Altman's startup class is it's all the startup wisdom we know condensed into 20 hours. Like if you're thinking about starting a startup, you really must watch that. It's some of it is sort of technical stuff about startups, like it covers funding and financing and HR and all the sort of secondary things you need to know, but mostly it's about like how to figure out how to go from something, like how to go from your first idea to like an idea that really works, which is super hard. So like basically we'll invest in anything as long as we see big potential and like the right founders for the job. That we talk about this thing called founder market fit, which is like there are lots of good founders and there are lots of good markets, but but often you see founders that aren't right for a particular market. There are people that maybe do have some domain expertise, but they're starting a startup that they don't actually know very much about the domain. So so if they're like the right people for the job, and we think this thing is like good for the world. So for example, we don't fund gambling or penny auctions, or we don't fund porn. There's a bunch of things we don't. I don't think that's bad for the world. I just think it's there seems to be enough already. We do fund medical cannabis, which is slightly controversial. So that's what we do. So now let me get to the part where I give some dangerous advice about how to turn your idea into, how to get your idea in front of millions of people. So like the best time to start a startup is a few years before the idea seems like a good idea, which is sort of like, it's not that actionable. It's like saying turn left 10 miles before the yellow house. How do you know when it's time? And you can't really know. But a big heuristic is like understand what's changing in the world. Lots of things are changing fast. Some things are changing slow. And try to like figure out some way of putting yourself in the future. If you're trying to look at some particular trend, like when we started ViaWeb, we were thinking like there's a few online stores, but eventually there'll be a lot. So like, what's that going to need? I'll talk about some ideas at the end and maybe that gives some examples about how to think about like if this changes, like what are all the businesses that need to be started to satisfy that need. So the most important thing to get right with your startup is having the right co-founders. Like I said, it's super hard. There will be all kinds of times when it seems like it's all doomed and you should have just gotten a job. Like if the idea doesn't work, you'll have to like suffer all this bad stuff with them. And if the idea does work, you'll be working together for 10 years at least to make a big company out of it. So it's got to be people you really like, not just people that, like the worst thing is these sort of startup marriages of convenience where you think, oh, I want to do this, but I don't actually know about this important part, but I'll find some guy who knows about that. Those don't usually work. It's much better to start a startup with people that you really like and can imagine working with for a long time and going through tough times together. And you can learn about the whatever missing pieces you might not have. And it's important to be part of a community too. I mean, the co-founders are part of the people, but you gotta hire people you like working with, and it's important to be part of a community of founders that you like and that support each other. So we've seen, it must be 100,000 by now ideas. We get like 6,000 every 6 months of sort of business plans, and we've funded nearly 1,000 and seen which ones worked and which didn't. So even though in some ways we have more experience trying to guess what's a good idea than anyone, we're not that good at it. It's just really hard to know because everything that was previously a good idea is no longer a good idea. All the good ideas seem surprising. And they always have to be a little ahead of their time when you start. So here's how Peter Thiel, very well-known Silicon Valley investor and one of the founders of PayPal, talks about what's a good idea. It's like lots of things are good businesses, and there's lots of businesses that no one else is starting. And it's that intersection that is the right thing to do. Like a pizza restaurant's a good business because everyone likes to eat pizza. But there are lots and lots of pizza restaurants, so it's hard to start one and have it get huge. So figuring out what's a great idea that no one's starting, and you better have an answer for why no one else is starting it. Often, sometimes the answer is no one's thought of it, but that's not usually people have thought of more things than you think. Sometimes the answer is it seems like an enormous schlep. I can't bear undertaking it. Like Uber, for example. Lots of people had the idea of you should be able to hail a taxi with an app, but they thought, oh God, I don't want to deal with taxi lobbies and city planning and all that kind of stuff. So that's an example of an idea that's a good and obvious idea, but no one was doing it because it seemed too hard. And so that's the way of thinking about it for an investor, but if you're the guy starting the startup, there's this additional circle that you want to be in, which is things where you have some special, you have some advantage over everyone else who might notice that same orange square. The things you'd be great at. Once you start with an idea, which is probably 80% wrong, you'll know that it's wrong. And if you talk to users, they'll give you reasons why they think it's wrong, and sometimes that gives you some insight as to what to change, but it's usually not just the answer. So what you have to do is iterate. What we've found is that you could there's two theories about how to iterate. One is do it fast, but without a very deep thought. And the other is put a lot of deep thought into each iteration. And so this is sort of the big company way of doing it, where the engineers build something and then it's tested and you send it to user testing and then you gather feedback that's part of some user interview process, and a project manager comes up with new requirements and someone schedules it, and going around that loop takes at least months, often a lot longer. And the idea sort of gets misunderstood by at least five different brains along the way. So although, like, it has the advantage of, like, in that analyze feedback thing, you get statistical rigor. Like, you're not misled by one weird outlying user. But the startup way of doing it is, like, write code, talk to users, repeat that, like, every day. Maybe every week if you have to build hardware. And then the idea only has to get misunderstood by two brains. But more importantly, like, there's no theoretical reason for why, but just empirically what we've found is that startups that iterate every day are the ones that succeed. And I guess that means that the deep thought you might put into analyzing user feedback and really considering what that means in the great scheme of things that you could do if you were iterating only once a month is worth less than more iterations. And as a meta point, like this advice is itself iterated. Like, we've given different advice over the years to different startups about how to iterate, and this is the advice that worked better. So let me talk about some actual ideas. I mean, for two reasons. One is that, you know, there's a lot of people that have had some idea for a long time, but they're sort of reluctant to propose it because it certainly seemed crazy at the time they first came up with it. You know, there's a lot of ideas that, you know, if you'd had 10 years ago, like, indeed, it would have been a bad idea to start then because it was just too early. But now might be the good time. And so we like to sort of go around and talk about these ideas that we think, like, now is actually the right time to do. We have a big list of them at that URL. We call them requests for startups. You know, startups that we hope someone will start. So yeah, I'll talk about ideas partly to say that, like, if you've been thinking about this, you should talk to us, and partly to give some examples about how we think about ideas and, you know, change and how to be ready when the next wave of change hits. So Elon Musk describes fossil fuels as the dumbest experiment in the history of the world. Like, let's take all this carbon out of the ground and burn it and see what happens to the climate. We really should stop. We funded a bunch of companies doing this, and some are making pretty good progress. I mean, the two things that seem promising are solar and then clean nuclear. There's like two new nuclear technologies that don't have the meltdown problems that seem to sometimes happen in the older technology. And the thing that's happened the thing that's different now than all the clean energy, like, people tried lots of clean energy things in the 80s, but the solar technology wasn't nearly good enough, and the capital wasn't available. Like, interest rates in the 80s were just too high to invest in solar. But now with interest rates at like 1%, you can build giant solar farms that take 20 years to pay off. And there's like a whole bunch of other reasons too. So this is an example of a startup that does actually need a business guy because the margins are thin and the business is complicated. It's not just a pure technology play. But, you know, this sector in general is probably going to create $100 billion businesses over the next several years. Like, looking at what solar farms need, you know, they need software to control the stuff. They need, like, giant robot arms to aim the solar panels. They need ways of cleaning the solar panels. Like, these guys need everything, and none of that exists yet. So you could start a company doing any of those things for solar or for the various new nuclear technologies and probably be a great business. Artificial intelligence is, again, if you tried to start an AI company in the 80s, you lost. But the technology has come an enormous way in the last several years. A lot of that coming out of University of Toronto. So the hard part is figuring out what version 1 of various kinds of AI is good for. Almost certainly the answer is not, building like robots that go do human jobs. The answer to any particular job you look at is some very different answer than having a bunch of like artificially intelligent robots like sitting in chairs, sitting in front of screens, doing it. So what's the way to think about what kind of AI startup is a good one to start is to look at things that AIs can do that people can't practically. Not try to take away jobs from that people are already doing satisfactorily. So talk about some examples that already exist. Google Translate, if you've used it, like it gives you you can give it a web page in any language, and it gives you a reasonable, if somewhat, not very fluent translation in English. So that's a giant thing, right? Like I can now read business articles from anywhere in the world. And that used to be something that you would pay a translator quite a bit, like hundreds of dollars per article to translate it for you. So that actually doesn't replace translators, because if you want a good translation, you got to hire a human. But if you want this other thing that humans couldn't do, which is a translation in a couple of seconds, like it's for free, it's this super useful thing. So that already exists. But it's an example of the right way of using AI technologies to create something useful. Another sort of extreme example is video game non-player characters. If you counted up the number of like human-like things that are moving around and talking to each other, there's like hundreds of millions going on right now in video games. And that's not replacing actual people, except in some very limited sense. Like kings used to actually employ like people to entertain them and make jokes or something in front of them. And now like all that much of that live entertainment has been replaced by interactive video games. So if you tried to estimate the salary of like if a person were doing every non-player character in video games, that would be trillions of dollars, and yet like it just sort of costs nothing, and it's really easy. So those are the kinds of things to do with AI, is things that it's like you can do it, either 1,000 times faster or 1,000 times cheaper, somewhere where it's like this qualitative difference from the way people are doing it. So the other way to think about this, AI for a lot of things isn't ready yet, but it will be soon. So a good kind of company to start is one that will benefit a lot from AI. So the way to do that is to try to build a process with people doing it, where at some point you'll be able to slot in AIs to do it better. A good example that we funded is Clara Labs. It's like a virtual scheduling assistant. You can copy it on emails saying, let's meet at 4, and it'll do the email back and forth and put it in your calendar, and keep, if the guy needs to cancel, it'll tell you, and it does most of that stuff. And that's currently all done manually by people, but the point is that can be, at some point that'll be automatable, and then that service, instead of costing $1,000 a month, can be $1 or something. So those are the kind of the two ways we think of leveraging near future AI is like build an organization now that will benefit a lot, and figure out this use case where it's 1,000 times better than people doing it. Like I mentioned, like health is just the biggest broken thing. People are dying. And so we fund almost all the companies in the U.S. Where the healthcare market is much more broken than here, and it's the challenges are kind of different. A lot of the challenges in the U.S., like to create a startup doing healthcare in the U.S., it's either regulatory approval or like actually getting paid for the things you do. Like you can do things to help people, but unless there's a billing code, you don't get paid for it. I think Canada is a little better at being able to like compensate people that provide wellness services that keep people from getting sick in the first place. Self-driving cars are coming. There's like tens of them driving around Silicon Valley now. So you might start a self-driving car company or a sensor company. We funded a couple of those. But the bigger disruption is going to be all the businesses that can have a new structure because of it. Like doctors making house calls is barely a thing now. And it's because doctors don't want to spend all day driving around. But if they had a self-driving car where they could just get in it and then they could be typing up their notes from the last session and reading up about the next patient the whole time that the car is whisking them to the next thing, probably a lot of healthcare would get delivered that way. And I think that's true for a lot of professional services, that professional services will be delivered to you on site if it weren't for this annoying problem that people don't like driving. So that's an example of sort of saying there's this technology that's coming. What's it going to enable? And how do I start building a business today that's going to enormously benefit from that? So you can start that business today. You got to find some doctors that are willing to drive themselves. And then when that technology does come online, you'll be ahead of everyone else who is trying to catch up to you. That's that principle that like usually the winners are the guys who are doing it like a couple years before it became a good idea. So if you do some kind of professional services, you should try that yourself. Like you should make some deal with a friend where he'll drive you around for a week and see what it would be like. If driving weren't a chore. If you could just like, get in a car and be taken somewhere and go do your rounds, see all your clients. Maybe it doesn't work for your profession, but if it does, it would be a really valuable insight to have today. Better education is one of the fields we're most excited about. That is kind of the enabling thing that would give the world the brain power, enable the world's brain power to solve all the other problems we have. To solve the problem of how are we going to replace all our fossil fuels with solar panels, we need a lot of educated people to do those jobs. Basically every single person in the world could be better educated. So if you think about the ways of like making the world a better place, education basically outperforms almost everything else. Khan Academy is one of my favorite startups in this. It's a nonprofit, not a startup, but they act like a startup. So their ratio of students helped per dollar that they raised is amazing. It's like $1 per student. They help millions of students and they've raised only millions of dollars from donations. I'm sure your tuition here is more than $1. Because they use technology to figure out how to do it, how to scale it for just the cost of streaming videos. So there's so much more to do there. Like there's a significant amount of good content, but there's an enormous amount of educational content that doesn't exist yet. So creating that, I think it's hard to make billions of dollars doing this, but you can affect billions of people's lives and make a few dollars. So you might like that trade-off. But the most important thing is that the best ideas to start probably aren't on our list or anyone's list. They're ideas that come from your unique experience of the world. Like, what do you see that no one else sees? It could be a bad idea, but if it's a good idea, that's the thing to start. We need more people to start companies. People sometimes think that the limiting factor in funding companies is having enough money, but it's not. It's having enough people that want us, that are suited to and want to start a company. We seem to be able to find about 200 teams a year, but the world needs a lot more innovation than that. So we'd love to hear from you guys if you have something you want to start. For this funding round, applications are due in a week and a half, October 13th. And people that have applied and not gotten in say they found that doing the application was worthwhile, that it helped sort of focus their thought on what is our company actually going to do, because we sort of lead you through the process of explaining it simply. But if you do get in, you get 120K advice, introductions to, we basically know all the investors in the world now, certainly all the ones in Silicon Valley. And that world of next stage funding is still unfortunately a little bit clubby. You can't submit your idea to their website. So they sort of want they want people that come with an introduction, so we do that. And you get to be part of this community of committed, sincere, helpful founders, that have all promised to keep each other's secrets so you can share what's not working with them. And we tell you to focus, which is one of those things where it's one of those bits of advice that you could write down in one word. You can write focus on your mirror, just like you can write lose weight or get in shape or learn more. It's really easy to write, but hard to do every day. So we kind of built this program as a structure to sort of help people focus. A big part of, one of the struggles we have all the time is things not to do in the program. There are lots of ideas we've had for things we could teach the founders, and we could have a seminar on this and a seminar on that, and have a meetup about this. But we internally say no to 95% of those ideas because we know that the most important thing is to focus on writing code and talking to users. Or writing code could be building the product in some other way, but it's doing the thing, and not getting caught up in distractions. So that's what I had to say. Thanks for coming.
Hi, Trevor. Great talk. I'm interested in the 30% of the firms that you are funding this year anyway that have a harder time iterating, longer timelines perhaps, and maybe greater technical uncertainty. And you mentioned, I think, that you had 3 firms right now that are trying to cure cancer, or that's their focus. Could you tell us what Y Combinator can do for those sort of firms with that sort of timeline?
We didn't fund those at first. We started off really sticking to things we knew that were online social things. But we funded a few and it worked very well, so we funded more. And what we found is that many of those things can be iterated a lot faster than thought. If you just go by news stories coming out of NIH or something, it seems like everything takes 5 to 15 years. But many of these many of these either healthcare or biotech things, like if we've worked with them to figure out some way they can iterate something pretty quickly. There was a growth chart I saw that went like this, but rather than being like units sold or something, it was the amount of glowing that they were building glowing plants, glow-in-the-dark things. Not because that's useful in itself, but because it was a proof of technology for how to splice genes into plants instead of just algae, which is understood. So they had their metric was like number of iterations they did per week, and they were getting like 5 iterations per week last I talked to them, of like trying a gene sequence and growing it into a plant and seeing how much it glowed. And they had an exponential graph going up that was like measured in lumens. So nanolumens probably, but it's like there is often some way that you can figure out a way of iterating and getting exponential growth, even in biotech.
Hi, my name is Will Chen. So I'm sure Y Combinator gets hundreds, if not thousands, of applications, and so do many other VCs. What are some of the things that help a business plan or an application to stand out that will help someone like me to get funded?
Yeah, the things we look for, we have some opinions about the idea, but we're pretty open-minded about ideas. What matters to us are, like, do the people seem like the right people to take this, to turn this like barely an idea into a real thing, and like some kind of usually we find that people that start a successful company had been thinking about it or fiddling with the idea for years. Like Eric Midjikovsky, who started Pebble, sort of the first smartwatch, really. He showed me pictures of like 5 years before he came to Y Combinator, and he had this like big aluminum box strapped to his wrist that he had hand soldered and had like wires dangling out the side. But he had been like noodling on that idea for years. So it does, like, usually it comes out of, like, the right founders for an idea are usually people that like had been thinking about it somehow for a long time. And then like we ask on the application form, like what impressive things the founders have done, and like just about anything. Lots of things impress us. Certainly not just having started a company before. We had a world champion snowboarder from Slovenia in a recent batch, and like to be a world champion snowboarder, you got to have some determination, I think. So we figured he was determined. So it's like anything. There's definitely not some like template that they have to fall in. Like all the interesting ones are outliers in some way. So like, don't try to like pretend to be Mark Zuckerberg or something. Like, be yourself, and because that's what's interesting.
Hi Trevor, thanks a lot for the talk. It was really amazing to like listen to your talk. I have 2 questions. First is you're talking a bit about shortlisting online applications. Could you please shed some light on the evaluation criteria which you guys use while shortlisting companies? Is it like purely objective or purely subjective, or is it like combination of both?
You mean as part of the application process, or the ones I talked about here?
So the ones you shortlist, like I assume you will be getting, say, 1,000 applications after that, like you shortlist.
Oh yeah, right. So I mean, then the process is we open up applications. We get 6,000 typically. That's what we got last time. We can interview about 450 in person over a week and a half, and we fund maybe a third of those. Yeah, I mean, I don't know if there's much of a science to it. We just have people with some experience read them. these days we rely on our alumni network too to help us read through them. And so basically anyone that someone finds pretty interesting will get an interview. You know, and it's either because like the founders are perfectly suited to this, or like one of them just seems like a butt kicker, you know, in general, or like the idea is so compelling, and these guys are really sincere about doing it, and it's all kinds of different things.
So I assume it's mostly subjective in many sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, boy, we wish we could somehow automate this, because reading 6,000 applications in like trying to read through that many in 2 weeks with like 30 people doing it, that's like the most painful 2 weeks of our year. And one of the things we found, like, investors often seem like jerks. And the reason we discovered is that they meet with people every day that they have to say no to. So we had this, one of our ideas was we're gonna like only have like this 3 weeks every 6 months where we were saying no to people. And the rest of the time we were working with people we had already said yes to, and so, you know, we could be super nice to them.
Okay. Thanks a lot for the answer. And second question was, you mentioned a lot about like new ideas, like startups focusing on new ideas. So could you talk a bit about like best in market versus first to market, like people or companies which want to develop a product on an existing idea just to make like a better user experience of the product? Do you like fund these such ideas as well?
We do sometimes fund ideas that are like there's someone already doing it, but they're doing it badly enough that we think it needs another company. We don't usually fund ones that are just trying to attack an existing player that's already like doing a pretty good job of it. Maybe sometimes, but not usually. Usually it's useless to make a frontal attack on a player that's doing a good job already. The answer is almost always like do something that they're ignoring. Like if they're in the middle of the market, you either go for the top or the bottom somehow, or like the way to you know, like it's in some ways like Airbnb took business away from Craigslist because that's where people used to advertise sites, and it would be crazy to just try to make a new Craigslist, but finding this one niche that you can do a much better job of because you just focus on getting that one thing right is a great way of doing it. So like, you know, if someone's doing a very broad-based service, sometimes you can pick a niche and focus on that.
Thanks a lot for the chat. That was great. Is software dead?
Oh no, my gosh. There's so much software the world needs. Just the very idea of doing something online is probably not a big enough idea anymore. Like there were a lot of startups that got started just taking advantage of the amazing thing that you could do things online now, but about half of the companies we fund now are selling software to businesses. And not many of them are on that slide because they don't really get consumer brand recognition, but they make an enormous amount of money. You know, the amount of software, you know, like farms need software. There's a great company we funded doing that, a few of them. You know, like every kind of hospitals need software to like track their stuff and you know, keep track of whose shift it is, and like all those are there's so much stuff that's not done yet, and there's also some things that were done long enough ago and the company has failed to keep updated that you can attack them. You know, when like if you look at what people working at airlines have behind the desk, like it's shocking. So someone will someday write some good software for that. There's hundreds of examples like that. So by no means.
Thanks for that. When you get an application or business plan, what's the first page or section that you turn to right away?
Oh, the founders. I mean, I want to get us. I mean, at first I read the one sentence about what they're doing just so I have some context, and then I look at what the people wrote about themselves. One of the things, at first we thought, you know, having gone to like a big name university would be correlated with success, but we actually haven't found that. We found that, like if anything, Stanford students were a little too arrogant to start startups, and so most of our startups don't come from Ivy League universities actually. I mean, many do, but just like try to get a sense for like, are these people like, are they gonna like work together? You can only really judge that in an in-person interview, but you get some sense from like, did they just, like, we ask how you met, for example. So, you know, if you just met at a hackathon last week, it's maybe not such a good team. But there's really no science to it. You know, we just sort of try and get a sense of them.
I'll throw in a question.
Sure.
So one of the things you talked about is iteration of software and how that's changed. What are you seeing in terms of manufacturing with the companies you're working with in 3D printing? What's sort of the impact?
Building hardware has gotten enormously easier. Like basically 10 years ago or even 5 years ago, it was really hard to start a hardware startup because you needed millions of dollars to be able to get a product put together. And it was hard to raise millions of dollars unless you had a track record. But like we've seen a lot of hardware startups like get a working prototype together for, you know, the sort of tens of thousands of dollars of our money that they can spend on it. And then, you know, when people can see that it really works and these guys can deliver the product they say they can and that it's something people would want, then they can raise the big amount of money it takes to get into manufacturing. Also, crowdfunding of hardware works surprisingly well, either through Kickstarter or Indiegogo or just by doing their own campaigns. You know, Pebble is actually a good example of, they talked to all the VCs in the Valley and they basically all said, no, like a watch, that's crazy. You know, people don't wear watches anymore, except for like $10,000 mechanical ones, like we all have. And so like they got a pretty cold reception from VCs, but they did a crowdfunding campaign and made 10 million, they got $10 million worth of pre-orders, like 80,000 people ordering a $120 watch. That was the money they needed to get into production. So hardware sometimes requires a lot of money to get into production, but usually there's some way of working around it. Either, like it turns out you can build some really cheap prototype enough to prove the idea, or crowdfunding works out. And more investors are willing to fund it, like later stage investors. We have seen people raise like untested entrepreneurs with no track record, but you know, but great people with a great idea raise millions of dollars to build a hardware product. So it can be done.
As someone who went to school up here and moved down to the States, and you know, they say a lot of the startups, or you know, we don't have that risk. We have a little more risk aversion, and there isn't as much. What do you think Canada could be doing better in this climate to, as well as doing a lot of this here, to move a lot more innovation and startups?
Well, first of all, everyone has too much risk aversion. You know, when it comes to career choices, I mean, it's good to have risk aversion when riding a motorcycle or something, but like the worst thing that can happen to you starting a startup that doesn't work is not that bad. Like running a failed startup is super interesting for a year or so. You'll learn more doing that than you would doing most things. And it definitely doesn't hurt your long-term hireability. People from big tech companies love to hire people that at least tried to start a startup. So yeah, everyone should take more risks. So there's kind of two kinds of taking a risk. Like there's doing a startup at all rather than like getting a job. And then there's how big an idea you tackle. So if you tackle you can tackle a small idea that you're pretty sure no one else is going to compete with you, and like unless you really screw it up, you'll probably do okay there. What we really have to like work on people is like tackle the really big idea, like the one that'll have millions of customers if it works. And not that it's fun to fail, but it's more interesting to fail doing something big than to succeed doing something small, I think. I mean, you probably learn more.
As kind of a follow-up, the second company you said didn't do so well. Do you think that helped you better towards Y Combinator than if that second company didn't come around? Do you think you'd still be in the same place by having a successful the first time, or do you think that second one really helped?
Yeah, that's a great question. I definitely learned some things about how it feels like to fail, and it's not fun. I learned a bunch of things that you need to do, like I managed to find network and find jobs for everyone there, and cover their health insurance and all that kind of stuff. So I learned how to shut down a company, which comes in handy sometimes. I guess the interesting thing to learn was how it feels to be wrong, how it feels to have been so sure that people would just love this thing, and then nobody loved it, and trying to figure out why that was that was a worthwhile experience.
We have one final question.
Yeah.
Hi, my name is Alan Skinner. It's kind of irrelevant, but I want to just say a few things. I'm very, very impressed with the presentation we've had. Very humanistic and very encouraging. So I think there are a lot of people sitting around this audience who obviously have been through the MBA program. We're all alumni, I believe. And I will admit that I am a 1984 alumni, so that'll immediately make people say, oh my God, there's an old guy in the mix. Kirk, hello. Alan Skinner, how are you? Just wanted to say that when the presentation started, I got a really good feeling, a really warm, fuzzy feeling about encouraging people in business, which is what this is, a business school. And then, of course, up on the screen appeared things like that seemed to be socially redemptive type things that were going to be favored. And please believe me, I totally agree with that. I think that being a business school and being business graduates, a lot of us probably have dreams and ideas that relate more to business and ultimately to making money. And I guess that's not a dirty thing. But I started off in the world of banking, and that was and the bank put me through the MBA, which I'm eternally grateful to them. I'm not with them anymore, of course. But I think that we need maybe a little more encouragement for, say, the service industries, let's say insurance, real estate, that type of thing. People who've got models that might work and might streamline and might appeal in a niche way to a lot of people out there who are, in Vancouver, totally gobsmacked by the real estate prices, etc. here, and some more humanistic approach to selling real estate or to acquiring real estate. So I just wanted to say, I looked at this and there were things that were healthcare, et cetera, and I went through a cancer situation last year, which of course was not a lot of fun, and thank God I'm fine at the moment. But I just feel that maybe there should be, and there clearly is, Trivago type of models and things like that say the service industry is not a dirty industry, it provides a service. And if that is a service that is needed by the public, then it's a good thing. So,
we love the service industry and we love fintech, the financial services. So many people seem poorly served by the current financial world, and like banks didn't used to be evil. They used to solve this problem that people had, like they needed to buy a house and they didn't have the money, and so they would do this pretty simple thing of people would deposit money and they'd loan it out. But somewhere along the line they realized they could make more money by charging annoying fees on things. So the potential for disruption there is enormous because most people aren't super happy with their bank. So if you gave them something that they loved, a service that gave them the services they need and didn't charge them a lot of money, I think there's enormous potential there. That's definitely one of our RFSs, various kinds of fintech things. Also, fintech for the developing world has been surprisingly, it works surprisingly well. There's a couple of payments companies that are operating in Kenya, and one's in Kenya, one's in, I can't remember the other one. But those companies are ready to have modern finance. It's because everyone has a cell phone, it kind of works now. So the potential is giant, and that's the next billion customers for the banking industry, is in Africa and Indonesia mostly. So yeah, I'm a huge believer in financial services and services in general. And I'd pick up on one more thing you said, which was that a lot of the companies are socially beneficial, and partly that's a little bit due to us, that we like to fund things we want to exist, and so because it's our own money, we can do what we want. But more importantly, evil businesses can't hire good people, and so they don't go anywhere. You basically to get in this incredibly competitive labor market for programmers and especially for programmers, but for basically everyone. You got to have a mission that people believe in, or they'll join some other company. It's already the case that there are lots of companies. If you want to make the most money, you can go work for a hedge fund and probably make way more than you would working for a tech company. But the way to be part of something worthwhile is to work for a tech company that's doing something worthwhile. So it's a necessary. You have to be doing something good, or you won't be able to hire anyone good to do it.
Thank you. That's awesome. A round of applause.